Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is the video for week 11. I know, week 11 of all these weeks. We're getting really close to the end now. At this point, we should be today talking about the discussion and the conclusion sections, which really it's one big section. But let's jump over and look at the syllabus just so we can make sure we're all on the same page. So, here what's due this week on Sunday is the results section. Now, in order to do the results section, you have to have results, right? So, I mean, you need to take care of whatever you're going to do by the end of the week. I mean, that's really the idea here. And then you can do your discussion and conclusion. That's due next week. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking that we could probably bump this down if you need to, but I don't want to go any further than bumping it down 1 week. So I'm not going to change it, but I'll put it in an announcement. I'm not going to change it on here, but if you can't get the results section in this week, take an extra week. I would rather you have your results section right than on time, basically. So, if you did anything quantitatively, let me see it. I want to make sure that you've got it, in a way that's going to be effective. I know some folks were just finding things like percentages and, basically some descriptive statistics. And that's not comparing anything beyond just saying, okay, 74% of this group did it and, 62% of this group did it. That doesn't tell us if there's really a difference there or not. And so we'll want to go a little bit further. And again, like I've said from the very beginning, I'm here to help with that. So I can't help, though, if I don't know. I've only heard so far from one person who has sent me their stuff, but I know that several of you are using quantitative methods because of the pandemic and the ease of sending out a survey, which makes complete sense to me. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, results section, get it in this week if it's ready. If it's not, get it in next week, and then we can say that by the 18th, the discussion and conclusion section will be done. That week, we'll talk about connecting the dots. In other words, taking these pieces of a paper and putting them together into one thesis, really. You'll have written your thesis at that point. And then you can work to edit and revise and, do all that stuff you need to do to get it ready. And then you will do your conference style presentation, which is, your oral presentation on your project. That's supposed to be 8 to 10 minutes. And that, of course, is due, as you see here, by the 28th, which is a Wednesday. It's a little different because it's exam week, by 9 a.m. So any questions on that, let me know, and we can address them. But for now, let's talk about discussion and conclusion for both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So there are some differences between the ways that you might think of a discussion and a conclusion based on if you're doing a quantitative or a qualitative study. However, there are many more things that are similar than different. And here we go, discussion and conclusion. So, as you see in the header there, the opening paragraph, I really think that this is arguably the most important part of your paper because it's what folks will read the most. I can tell you, as somebody who writes research a lot and, I do it more quantitatively, people aren't going to, unless they're also quantitative researchers, they're not going to read all of my, eta squared values and coefficients for correlations. And that's Greek to most folks. And sometimes it's actually Greek, so eta squared. But what they will read is the discussion section. So think of it sort of as your chance to talk directly to an audience. And this is sort of the same with quantitative and qualitative approaches, but with like a qualitative approach, you're sort of having that ongoing discussion with an audience in a very conversational way throughout the entire paper. For quantitative work, focusing on statistics, you are focused for the first part of the paper on rigor and showing that, you know how to do the right testing in order to find meaningful results, whether they're significant or not, that you did it the right way so that you actually can say that something is or is not related or what have you. But when you get to the discussion, regardless of your approach, this is your time to really connect with the audience and to talk to them about a variety of things that will really directly impact them if they're reading it and they fall into the category of the things that you're studying. So as you see here, just always begin the discussion with a brief overview of what's to come. And just take a moment and let's focus on this for a quick second here. All of your sections really should be like this. Okay. So part of the reason that I had you do these individual chunks was so that you could see how they can be standalone, but they work much better put together. That doesn't mean, though, that you should only sort of use a preview at the very beginning and at the very end with a review. You should do this for every section. So, in your methods, you could even say things like, so this section will describe the approach I used to complete this study. First, I'll tell you this, second, that, third, this, and then last, this other thing. And then you actually do it with your headings. So go back and make sure that you have these sort of, we would call it an internal preview in a speech. It's the same idea here. It gives sort of the preview of a section and really be clear with what you're going to do there. Then do it. And here are some things that will probably be included in your discussion section. Now, the first one you see there is simply reinforcement. So you've already posted the results, and remember, in the results section, you did not discuss, you should not have discussed what those results mean or how you're interpreting them or, sort of how they can be applied. It's just what you found. If you're doing qualitative, it's here are the themes that I found, this theme, that theme, the other theme. And that's it. If it's the statistics, I ran this test and I found this thing. I ran this test and I found this thing. You might say that it either answered or did not answer your question, or it proved or disproved your hypothesis. But again, that's as far as you go with an analysis. When you get to this discussion, that's where you really get into what does it all mean. So if you're doing a qualitative paper, sort of the interview stuff, right? You can do that in a really general way. You don't need to go and list every research question or hypothesis. You see that there. This would be done, the listing each research question could be done, doesn't have to be, in a quantitative paper if you really want to discuss sort of what each individual finding means. But then at the end of that, you'll still want to say what they sort of mean all together. So you can take that or leave it for whatever it's worth. But if you're doing qualitative, don't even consider that as an option. Just start, talking to your reader. Then the way you can do that are through the implications. That's another header that you'll likely see. So tell the reader what they mean in, as you see here, both the big picture and more specific areas. You can discuss this with a few different sort of approaches, and you see them listed, what they mean to previous work. So what's out there from your lit review? What did you find? Let's say that you found, hypothetically, that people were less anxious about speaking when they completed a public speaking course at the university level. That's what the existing literature tells us. However, your study that looked at that found that during the pandemic, that did not impact, the fact that you've had a speech course did not impact your anxiety about speaking. Now, that can sort of say, look, in the big picture, we know that usually taking a class will reduce anxiety, but during special circumstances like we're in now, we see at least one exception to that, and that should be investigated further. Or in a more specific area, you could say that for college students that are in school right now during the pandemic, they need some extra considerations or training or reassurance when it comes to preparing for an oral presentation, because their anxiety should be higher based on what you found. So you might talk about how your findings either support what's out there, they counter it, or they might give an alternative explanation. So let's say that you found sort of the opposite finding, that during the pandemic, the anxiety levels of those who have taken a speech class really went way down, just plummeted. There was almost no anxiety. And then you bring that to light and say, listen, it always works. It always seems to reduce it in some way. But during the pandemic, it's like magnified. It's really reducing anxiety when you take a speech course. What could be an alternative explanation for that? Well, I don't know. We're living in a pandemic, so maybe people are seeing sort of their mortality and the real possibility of either themselves or someone around them dying. We see all these numbers. And so things like speech anxiety seem a little easier to deal with when you're not worried about, dying from it. That might be one explanation. So people rate it lower. If they rate it higher, you might say, we're in a pandemic. People have a lot of other stressors, and so their stress levels are already high. So when they are introduced with, having to give a speech, that just continues to increase because it adds on, and it's this multiplier effect of anxiety, right? It could go either way. I don't know what that study would actually find, but you can explain it in a way that really connects with your research and how that ties into other related research. Similarly here, a new understanding or revelation on the issue. So, again, that sort of fits with what we were just discussing. Maybe we now understand that it depends on when you took your speech class or the context of the time frame, pandemic, non-pandemic. You could compare those numbers. And then the last thing here is how the findings impact the understanding of a theory. So, if we are using uncertainty reduction theory, and that theory tells us that more communication leads to less uncertainty. Well, maybe we find that, people are less certain about how they are going to do on a speech during the pandemic than before. Well, why? The communication levels have stayed the same. We always have the same amount of communication in a course. So we would think the uncertainty would go down. So how could this impact that theory? Well, kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier with the idea of a multiplier of stressors. Maybe that's sort of counteracting the normal more communication equals reduced uncertainty. We might make the argument that, when we are uncertain about everything in our world, this is no different. And so it's just a very uncertain time overall. And that's sort of the vibe, if you will, for right now in our country, in our world. So, there's no hard right or wrong way that you could explain these things as long as they make logical sense. I mean, that's the key thing. They need to make logical sense. So the implications are big picture and or rather specific small picture of what you're looking at. Try to do both. The next header here might be things like applications. So how can the readers use the findings from your study? They say here, tell them how these findings apply and how they can inform future actions. So, and you see the example here, if you find that people are persuaded by happy messages from children in advertisements, and who reads advertising journals? Advertisers. Well, then in that case, you probably could publish in an advertising journal and note that finding should be taken into account. So if I am an advertiser and I read about, folks in my study said that they are more likely to buy something that is advertised using a positive message from a child as opposed to a positive message from an adult. Call in the kids, right? Let's get them in here so that we can make this commercial and see what our sales do. And this can go for a lot of different directions here as well. If we go back to the example of speech anxiety, then if we see that during the pandemic, speech anxiety goes up, well, how can I, as a speech professional, someone who would read these journals, use that? How can I apply it? And the answer might be things like, sorry if you can hear the noise upstairs. The answer might be things like, I should give additional support to my students because they're clearly going to need it. Or maybe that I don't deduct points because of what appears to be a nervous delivery because it's a special circumstance. I don't know. You could present both. You could say that, speech professors should consider this increased anxiety when they're grading. On one hand, they could provide more support. On the other hand, they could not deduct so many points based on, an apprehensive delivery. You could say both, and then the reader can choose what to do with it. Your job isn't necessarily to say, here's exactly what you need to do with this. Now, in some instances that will be more appropriate. So if you're researching, let's say, hard science, right? So the vaccines for COVID, the vaccine works. That's what you found. And now you want to tell people, go get the vaccine. That's when you're taking on this critical role as a researcher. If it is maybe you're researching how to close the gender pay gap. Great. Now you found that in these particular fields, there's a smaller gap than in other fields. Well, here's what you could tell people. What you need to do is find out how they're doing things different from you and do it more their way. And then we may see a more, equitable pay between men and women. So again, you don't have to get, down to the sort of really how to level, if you will, how to use this in your individual reader's life, but you can make some general suggestions. That's the way you would want to think of this. Now, the next heading that a lot of folks see, and by the way, these two are usually put together, limitations in future research, but they don't have to be. Realize that all research has limitations. And because you have some limitations, it doesn't mean that you did a bad study. Okay, that's not what that means. The idea here is that you want to acknowledge the limitations and state them so that people can understand those. Don't downplay them or ignore them or try to sweep them under the rug. People, especially students, when they're learning all this like you are, oftentimes will really just want to have an important finding. And so they will really go to lengths to make that happen. And it's not necessary. I mean, you don't need to do that. As long as you highlight what's going on, what was a limitation, you're fine. So some common ones include things like sample size or the composition. So, especially if you're doing something like a quantitative study and you have, 20 participants, that's not a big sample size. And you're not going to be able to generalize from that. So you can't say, because I, surveyed 20 people, I can now tell you that all humans think this way. It doesn't work that way. Or even all Grand Valley students think this way. No, you'll need at least, there are different calculations on how to come up with the minimum sample size required. But in general, you're looking at about 300 people is ideal. It can be smaller if you're looking at a much smaller population. Remember, the population is the group that you're making these predictions about. And the sample is the part of that population, the people that you pull out to participate as participants. So, if you are looking at a small business that has 20 employees and you are able to get surveys back from 13 of them, you can probably make some pretty decent generalizations. But in a different setting, you probably couldn't do that. It could also be that your sample size is not an accurate or an equal composition to reality. So in other words, if we find that at Grand Valley, I think it's something like 65% female, right? That's our breakdown between male and female students. But if I want to project out some findings about all Grand Valley students, and I have 300 participants, I've got my number, but 250 of them are male, and then the other 50 are female, I'm not on the right ratio with male to female participants. That doesn't mean that my findings are useless. It means that I need to acknowledge that I have these limitations. What it probably means is that I can make a pretty good prediction about male students, but that more research needs to be done with a better ratio between male and female participants that is more like what Grand Valley has. Another limitation might be that your study has a limited focus. And this is actually a good thing. Some people call this delimitation. And that means that you know what you want to find and you didn't go and look for other things. So some folks will say, or they'll ask you questions about, well, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? That will often trip up young researchers when they present. If you're at a conference, they'll say things like, oh, wow, that's a really good point. I don't know. And then they start to question their whole project. Don't do that. What I always tell folks to say is, I didn't look into that, but that's a very good thought. Thanks for sharing. And then move on to the next question. So if we're looking at speech anxiety and, we're in the pandemic, we see that, let's say the numbers went way up, more anxiety in the pandemic than before. If someone were to say, oh, well, you found your particular finding, but did you consider things like the age of the students? Maybe, older students are a little more anxious because they're not used to this virtual environment, whereas younger students have probably used it, especially first year students at the university who finished their senior year in high school virtually, probably going to see a big difference there, right? And you might think to yourself, oh shit, yeah, I probably would. Don't worry. You could say things like, that's a very good point, and there may be a difference there. However, my study was concerned with the entire student population, and I wanted to really focus on a broader view instead of specific groups. But I do think, this is why these two are often connected, future research would do well if they looked at those specific groups. Thank you for that question. That's a great idea. Next, moving on. Right. And so think about these things as you're writing, and that can sort of help you decide what you need to consider as a limit. It doesn't need to be everything. So like, for example, if you come to me and you say, yeah, Carl, I need help with these statistics, and we run the tests and, I tell you what it means and all that, don't put in your paper, one limitation is that I don't know much about statistics and I just trust that, the professor knew what he was talking about. That's not really what you need to do. In fact, what you could just add in later to the results section or the methods section is something like, once the data was collected, it was passed to a communication professor with PhD and experience with statistical analysis, who then processed these results, and here they are. Bam. That's all you need to do. I mean, that's not uncommon. I can't tell you how many times that people have come to me and said, hey, will you look at my stats? Part of the knowledge market is the Speech Lab, the Writing Center, Research Center, and Data Center now. But whenever there's a study there, the folks from the library usually come to me and say, Carl, can you run these numbers? Because they know that's what I do and I know how to do it. So it's not like it's a weakness. It's just that you're using a resource that you have, an expert that's locally available to do something that, you're not quite capable of doing. And that's okay. That doesn't mean it's weak. It just means that you realized I am not able to do this, so I'm going to hand it off to someone who can, and then I'll move forward with the project. That doesn't need to be listed as a limitation. In actuality, that is sort of a strong point, because if you would have just ran the numbers yourself, yeah, that'd be a limitation. If you just came back and said, you just took the time to read this whole paper, but it might mean nothing because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just plugged in some numbers, pushed some buttons, and here we go. That's a limitation. But giving it to someone else to look at is not a limitation. Another common limitation would be things like lurking or confounding variables not accounted for. So, for example, if you found that, again, speech apprehension went up during the pandemic, it would be those maybe demographics that you didn't ask about with your participants. So, was there a difference between different ethnicities? Was there a difference between genders? Was there a difference between sexes? Was there a difference between, who knows, right? Whatever. If you didn't look at that, that would potentially be what's called a lurking or confounding variable. It's out there and it's having some impact on your findings, but you didn't account for it. So that's why early on I said that if you're using statistics especially, ask more demographic questions. Ask more than you might need. If you don't use them all, that's okay, but at least you have it if you need it. If you're doing this with a qualitative approach, the same stuff still applies. I mean, let's go back to the top here and say that you want to look at implications, and you found that you interviewed 10 students at Grand Valley and they all said they felt more nervous when they were speaking during the pandemic. Okay, it's still the same implication. The suggestion is still the same, right? To professors, they should either give more support or don't count off as many points. Similarly with applications, how can they use this? And the example here would work as well. So now you didn't do a large scale survey, but you still found that, the 10 people you interviewed said repeatedly, kids in advertisements really gets their attention. Positive messages are more likely to persuade them. You put that together and say, oh, they like kids, they like positive messages. Let's try positive messages from kids. And that can be a follow-up study. And again, that's why the future research is often connected to these limitations. For limitations in a qualitative study, it could be that it could be sample size. I mean, usually always there's less of a need for a big sample, but if you're trying again to say, this is what I found about the group, and the group is 50 people, but you only talk to 3, that's a limit. That's a limit. Now, it doesn't mean it's valueless. It means that you found something interesting and that it needs to be explored further to see if that applies to a larger group or not. And that gets us down to this future research. So good research inspires additional research. We call that heuristic value. But here, the idea is that there's always more to know. And no matter how full or complete your study might be, there's always something else out there that should, be the next step. When you're a professional researcher, basically like a professor or someone, you're taught early on that you should have what's known as a research program. And what that means is that you don't sort of bounce around and research, this topic this year and that topic next year. And they're all connected because it's all based on communication. There's a saying that being eclectic is great when it's on your playlist, but being eclectic when it's on your research program is a weakness. That's the way not to get a job. So, I think there's some truth to that. I don't think it needs to be that you research the same thing over and over and over again with slight variations. But if you can make it into sort of a theme that's your deal, you're the blank person. Like, I'm the speech guy at Grand Valley. That's what I get, you can really sort of make a place for yourself, and you can show that you have value because of what you do. And so future research really, to me, sounds more like a career plan. So, first thing I'll tell you here with future research is that I don't want you to try and do everything with any study. For a few of you, or actually probably like half of you, I've already told you in your feedback, don't worry about all this stuff. Just look at one thing. Look at this one thing, do this well, and then don't worry about the other stuff right now. If you continued this, like you went to grad school or whatever it might be, then you could look at the next thing in a different study, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing. Next thing you know, you have a degree, and you have a lot of expertise in a particular area. So it's really important that you highlight future research. Now, some folks will suggest that you do things like a full replication. So this is when you perform a study, whether quantitative or qualitative, and then some other researcher, or it could be you for that matter, goes to a different group of people or a different group of participants and does the same study again to see if they find the same thing. So, if you're qualitative and you're looking at a group of 50 people and you interview 15 of them, fine. You find some stuff. Good. Now, do it again with 15 different people. See what other stuff you find. Was it the same stuff? Was it different stuff? Was it similar stuff? What it looked like, right? And that will give you a better understanding of that particular group. If it is quantitative, it's your survey that you've made. So give that to different groups of folks to see what they think. So if I want to understand college students in America, right? Broad group of, it's like 7 million people. Then just interviewing or surveying rather 300 people at Grand Valley doesn't quite get me where I need to be. I need to survey, 300 people ideally at every school in America, but that's not realistic either. So then I would delimit, right? Talk about limitations. Now I only want to know things about, division, like Grand Valley, Division II schools with nursing programs. Great. So now I can look at schools that fall into that category. Let's say that's still too many schools. Okay. Now I want to know about Division II schools with nursing programs that also offer master's degrees in nursing. I'm just making this up, but you see what I mean? You can get more and more exclusive with your sort of restrictions for participation, if you will. And that can help you narrow down sort of the groups you need to look at. So you might do that at Grand Valley. You might do that 10, 15 other schools that have all this, wherever it might be, then you can make these better, more accurate predictions, assumptions, conclusions, because you've seen it from a variety of angles. In sort of the same vein here, instead of a full replication, you might do what's called a partial replication. And this is where you do the same study, but you change at least one variable. So, you see the examples here. If you looked at college students the first time, you might look at people who have graduated from college in the last 5 years or 10 years or whatever it might be. You might do people from a different age group, people from a different ethnicity, people from a different whatever, right? Whatever group you want, you might look at something different. It could be even like a different profession. So if the original study here used race and sex as independent variables, add age and profession, for example, as independent variables. So here I've got this notion about McCroskey. So James McCroskey, I've mentioned before, did the PRCA 24, right? The Personal Report of Communication Apprehension. It's quantitative. It's a survey to figure out how nervous people are about speaking in front of others. So with that one, his original study was carried out in an airport. I don't know why he picked an airport, but that's what he did. So when he did this in an airport, he just gave it to people in an airport because that's where he was at. Then he thought, wait a minute here. Wonder if it'd be different if I did it somewhere else. So then he did it at a shopping mall. I can't tell you all the places that he did this, but basically McCroskey published the same study set in different settings, different locations, probably 40 times or so, 30 to 50 times. And he would just make small tweaks, and that would be another paper, another pub, right? And he's going to get promotions, and he's going to get an advancement at his universities, wherever he was at different places. But it really is something that you can do and make a career from. Now, you see there that these areas that we just discussed, like limitations, future research, again, they're often put together because think about it. If one of your limitations, let's go back up here, is a sample size or composition. Let's say it's the composition. So then you might say, this study had more males than females, and these numbers need to be more of a 50-50 ratio than what I had here. So in the future, what I think either I should do, or what another researcher should do, is to run this study again as a partial replication, but make sure that your sample is a nearly equal ratio between men and women, right? That'd be fine. That's what you're looking for. And so whatever you say, here's something that could have been done better, that probably will lead you then to say future research should do that in this better way, and just be clear about it. Now, that's really the discussion. And again, think of the discussion as your time to really talk to the audience about what things mean. Let's actually look at a couple examples here. So these two articles actually are the ones from our Blackboard site. And let's go and see what we've got here. So we know that just finished the literature review because there's the research questions. Here's the methodology. Here's the analysis, the findings, and basically they don't use these headings of discussion, but it starts here, lack of control. So what they found here were a few themes. One was a lack of control. And so they talk to you about what that means. And look at the language here. We can't control what people say. This is coming from the actual study. They're talking as though there's someone from the study. They're quoting them, but it's still written in a way that makes it feel very personable, really accessible. While the other parts of this, even in a quantitative study, you go up here and we look at things like open and axial coding. Unless you're a relative expert in the field, you don't know what that means, right? Open and axial coding. But when you get down to the lack of control, the inability to control social media and the struggle to stay ahead of social media posts represented a challenge. No matter who you are, you understand that, right? And you go on down, you can see other things here too. Let's see. I just want to make sure I get this right. Oh, this is the theory they're using, right? So then they're plugging in their theory, what it means for the theory. Another theme here was message content issues. So social media content presented a distinct challenge comprised of 3 subcategories: rumors, message consistency, and criticism. Again, don't need to be an expert to really get that. This is the plain talk part of your paper, if you want to think of it that way. Social media strategies was another one. And then they kind of come down here and they're going to land the plane. Here's some more that they've actually labeled as discussion. So districts are beginning to develop social media strategies to acknowledge this as an area of crisis communication. So how people can actually use it that are in the communication realm, if you will. You see how people, it's used by students, parents, and teachers. They represented a challenge for which districts were underprepared. So then if they're underprepared, what do you think they're going to give us here? Probably some advice. But Mazur, who's a researcher who I know, made important strides in discovering the volume of social media content during these school shootings. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. As suggested, social media make releasing information even more challenging as parents and students posted information quickly. Districts shared examples of how it was difficult to get out in front of this. Another key challenge were hoaxes. They provide evidence regarding the challenges misinformation presents. Let's see if they get to a suggestion for us. Districts offered a few social media strategies that can serve as a starting point in being effective crisis communication and hopefully can inform districts. Right. So then you see it there. Pre-established messages, what they're talking about, safety forums. So here's the way that they sort of found, here are the problems and here is how we can fix it. Same thing for more quantitative research, right? So here we've got the review of literature. We're going to come down, got to the methodology there. Here's more technical data. See, again, this kind of stuff, right? Cronbach's alpha, scale, N of items. People won't always know what that means, and that's okay. This part's not really written for them, the general public. Here's the results still, and then we move to discussion. So, consultants in the classroom. So, look at this. Center administrators who want to insert consultants in the classroom have a suggestion for direction. Insert them in the classroom using a workshop approach. There it is, right? Very clear for this heading. And then I get into some details about what that might mean. Then, instructor and consultant feedback. As a co-author of this research, the Confederate instructor, or the participant in this study, is able to supply feedback for both experimental groups. Pros and cons were cited, but ultimately a preference was shown for the workshop model. There it is. That's nice and clear. What about the embedded group? So this is within this feedback here. 3 major drawbacks. So here are the problems. Another drawback while they're doing this. Let's see, did we get down to, finally, less than sufficient communication between consultants and center administrators was cited. This became a logistical challenge. Regular attendance might increase familiarity for consultants with students, the instructor, and the material. It did not seem to benefit the larger classroom experience. So while there's no clear suggestion on how to do it well, what is shown there is, look, we thought this might be helpful. We tried it, didn't seem to work. So don't waste your time on this. Try something else. And then we go on down with others, and you see this sort of stuff here. I do have an additional findings heading here, things that weren't directly related to the research questions, but were still important. And so you'll see some of those listed there. Then you've got our future research and limitations. They have heuristic value. That's what I was telling you earlier. There's a typo in there. Hopefully they fixed that before this went to press. Similar limitation, finally. So I've got at least 3 different examples of limitations. And then for each one, I think, let's see, sample size used. Future research should include more participants. Second, this study only looks at one course. How will this work with other courses? These should be used for future research. Finally, prefer students use resources more frequently than they do. We know it's a challenge to get them in the door. One solution could be, right, again, problem, solution, problem, solution, problem, solution. Then This is it. This is the conclusion. It starts right there. This study provides communication centers with an increased ability to make informed decisions about attaching consultants to the classroom and to continue investigating new opportunities for growth and development. Blah, 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 blah. Right? You can read all that. But the idea here is that there's nothing really new. One thing that I will point out here, now that we've sort of moved through the discussion, let's talk about conclusions. Conclusions should be ideally very similar to the introduction. Let me explain what I mean with that. In the introduction, your main job is to give a clear rationale or a justification for why your study needs to be done. Let's go to the top here and see what we used. So it starts here. The history of university communication centers is long and goes directly through the doors of university writing centers. So sort of background on where comm centers started. They used a Socratic approach. And then let's see, similar missions, blah, 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 blah. There's the Grand Valley Knowledge Market. At some point here we go, yeah. Therefore, the Grand Valley Knowledge Market administrators are a group of made of each center's administrators decided to pilot a program that inserted staff from each service where the learning takes place in the classroom. That's the key thing here that sets this study apart from others. It looks at tutoring centers that move out of their center and into the classroom. Let's go to the bottom. You see it right there. Highlighting our unique skills and the ways in which they complement one another is encouraged and can be delivered directly to where the learning happens, the classroom, right? So again, when I say mirror, it doesn't need to be exact, but it should be similar. You know, we said at the beginning, we're looking at the classroom, how sending in consultants there might work. We found that out. And now we see we've got some more advice, some more knowledge that will let us better go into those classrooms. Let's see the other one. I don't know this, so I'm just kind of coming into this blind. I'm taking a chance here. Although this study represents a step forward in school crisis research, limitations exist. Future research might extend this. Learn from the district's communication. Research in this vein can take key steps toward enhancing school communication crisis. Let's see what they did at the very beginning. Shootings are relevant. A rise in these shooting incidents per year. There's a big number of these. So they're giving us the reason they need to do it is because they are so prevalent. And then back to the bottom for one more quick look. Oops, too far. They told us about the prevalence, a step forward in school crisis, limitations exist, future research, that experienced shootings to learn from the district's communication during and after the crisis, research in this vein. Okay, they're not all perfect. I mean, this one doesn't really quite do it that way, but if we just kind of move up one here, we see that moving toward more specific strategies and better informed regarding social media challenges can increase the effectiveness of districts' crisis response, potentially saving lives. So we saw at the beginning, these things are increasing. School shootings are increasing. Then at the end here, to wrap everything up, they're talking about basically, since they're increasing, here's how we can save more lives. Here's why it's still important as a reminder. So again, they're not all going to look exactly the same, but they should be kind of similar. Let's just for fun here, right? Let's do speech anxiety study. Let's see what we find here. Scholarly article, visualization. Okay, let's see if we can get this one. You got the whole article available for me? You do not, do you? Okay. Let's just go over to gvsu.edu/library and journals, actually databases. Databases, Academic Search Ultimate. So it'll just take one extra second, but it'll be a much better result. Speech anxiety search. It's going to be a lot. 85,000. Let's do full text, scholarly journals only. Whoops, nope, come on, stay on there. Look, the first article written about this was 1893. Interesting. So where are we now? I'd really like to see this 1893 piece. Can I sort my results, please? I can do this. Recent cases, the Harvard Law Review, 1893. PDF full text. Interesting. Look at that. So yeah, this isn't going to be ideal for our purpose, but sorry, I need to get back on track here. Let's go back to the results. Let's spread this guy out. Oops. I'll just pick one at random here. Let's go with this one. Let's do a full text article. All right, communication competence and the intensity of anxiety and stress in medical staff, preliminary report. Introduction, medical personnel requiring special set of communication competencies. Every day they have contact with illness, suffering, crisis, family. Many patients and their family members, the situation of hospitalization is a moment of crisis. Blah, blah, blah. Let's go to the bottom. You can do it. Okay, here we go. To conclude, healthcare professionals use various coping strategies when exposed to stressful situations. The choice of strategies depends partly on their profession, the coping strategies being used to correlate with the communication strategies. Also, the level of anxiety is associated with all dimensions of communication, barriers, tactics, and readiness. So, I mean, it's not the exact same words, but look, healthcare professionals use various coping strategies when exposed to stressful situations. Yep. And at the top, if you'll recall, medical professional requires specific set of competencies. What are they? Coping strategies, right? I mean, so it's all connected here. And again, it doesn't have to be the same wording. It can just be something similar. And I'll finish with this. When you think of why this matters, it's the same here as it is in a speech, for example. And we call it ring structure. And this is from Isocrates, ancient Greece. But basically, you've all heard of coming full circle. And that's what you do when you end and begin a speech, a paper, any message in the same place. So, if it's a speech and you're telling a story, you can stop the story, get into the meat of the speech, and then come back and finish the story. You could do that in a paper as well. If you cite a statistic at the beginning of a speech or paper, come back to it at the end, but now we should probably think a little differently about it because of what you've shown us with your work. So to go back over here, I've given you some information on what these might look like. I'll tell you that a vignette is what is often called a brief story or illustration that gets a reader's attention and brings them to the topic at hand in a storytelling-like way. If you're doing qualitative, a vignette is really nice. It's usually something that is story related, and it highlights the importance of the study you're doing. So, if your study is about how to help sexual assault survivors communicate about their assault, you might tell a story of someone who was assaulted and the struggles they had. And then you can stop that story, and then you can talk about all your stuff. And at the end, you can come back and either tell us that they had a good ending, and it was sort of this, but this person knew this information, they tried this information, it worked for them. Or it could be this information wasn't available for the person because you're going to give them a name. But if it were available, maybe things would be different. And so now it is available for other victims, because unfortunately this isn't going to stop. And, now you're sort of, again, tying it all together. And there is that idea again of ring structure right there. For quantitative, it's less storytelling, more just what I call a brief contextualization of the subject. And both of these, though, rationale and summary, rationale, summary, right? That's what you're doing here. But they should always, as you see it there, just as with qualitative work, the conclusion of quantitative work should mirror the introduction, or at least be very similar to. Okay. So with that said, that is what I've got for you this week. If you have questions on this or anything else, let me know. Don't forget, just as we shoot back up to the top for a quick second, that longer than I recall. There we go. This week, you have results section due on the 4th, which is this coming Sunday. But again, if you're not ready, I would rather you hold off on that if you're not ready to turn it in. I'd rather it be right than on time. But if you are ready, or if you've got something you want me to look at, I'm happy to do that, give you the feedback, and then, we can go from there. As always, if you need me, let me know. I'm around. I can answer your questions. If not, I will talk to you soon, and let me know if you run into any issues. And again, if you have those stats that need to be run, let me know that too. I'm happy to help.